Four Crowns. Episode 8. The Knife in the Accord. Written by Mia. We had 11 hours until moonrise, and Cass spent the first one doing the thing I'd promised him at the start I'd never let him do again, being alone with it. I found him on the scorched terrace where he always went to be the version of himself nobody got to see, and he wasn't grinning, and he didn't try to. "Don't," he said before I could speak. "Don't do the thing where you tell me I'm not the spare. Because here's the joke, Ava. Here's the actual joke my father built." He laughed, and it was awful. For the first time in my whole useless life, House Flame needs me. I'm the most important person in Vaymore for the next 11 hours. The spare is finally the heir. All I have to do is hand them the woman he stopped. All I have to do is be exactly what he always said I was. A thing that fails the people who trust it. And if I don't, he scatters the bond, and Sable and Rune and Bram die in the morning, and that's on me too. He found the one move where every version of me loses. He's good. I'll give the bastard that. He's always been good at me.
Kya?
I sat down next to him, close, the way Bram had taught me without meaning to. Look at me. He built this trap out of one belief, that when it comes down to it, you'll choose being valued over being good. That's the whole bet. 26 years of calling you the spare so that when the moment came, you'd be so starved to finally matter to him that you'd do anything. I took his face in my hands. He doesn't know you. He never bothered, because if he'd ever once actually looked at the son he threw away, he'd know the truth I've known since you noticed I liked the city. You are the least selfish person in this tower. You hide it behind the jokes because being known as kind got you nothing in that house. But I know, and I am betting everything, me, the bond, the city, on the thing your father was too lazy to see. You're going to choose right. Not because I asked, because it's who you are when nobody's making you perform. He looked at me with his bright, terrified eyes, the spare, the unchosen, and he said, very quietly, "And if you're wrong about me?" "I'm not," I said. "But if I were, I'd still rather be wrong having trusted you than right having not. That's the thing nobody ever did for you, Cass. So I'm doing it. I trust you. Go see your father. Choose." He stared at me. And then the most heartbreaking thing happened, the thing that told me exactly how starved he was. He didn't believe the trust part, and he tested it the way a kicked dog tests a held-out hand. "You're sending me to my father," he said, "with the woman I'm bound to as the prize, on nothing but a bet that I won't sell you. You've known me 8 days. Anyone sane would lock me in the cellar and keep me away from him." "Anyone sane," I agreed. "I've never once been kept by anyone sane. They were all very sensible, the people who handed me back. Sensible is just fear wearing a good coat." I stood. "I'm not going to be sensible about you, Cass. That's the whole gift. Somebody finally looking at you and choosing not to be careful. Now go, before I cry, because you've got 11 hours and I refuse to spend any of them watching you decide whether you're worth trusting. You are. Move." And he went, but he stopped in the doorway, just for a second, and pressed his forehead to the frame the way they all did to my hands, like the trust itself was a weight he had to brace under before he could carry it. I have never given anyone a more dangerous gift in my life, and I have never been more certain of one. He chose right. Of course he did. I never once doubted it, which is the only reason I could send him. But his father had been good at him, and his father had planned for right, because a man who's spent 26 years studying how to make his son feel worthless has also studied exactly what that son will do when he finally finds his spine, and Flame's lord had never actually needed Cass to betray me. He'd needed casts gone from the tower, drawn out, so that the defense of the source dropped from 4 champions to 3 for 1 critical hour at dusk. And at dusk, the houses came. Not Shadow alone this time. Shadow and Flame together, the cold woman and the cold man, the two who'd each tried to take the source their own way and had finally, sensibly, stopped competing and combined. And they came not to collar me, but to do the thing Flame's lord had described in the dawn, the thing the whole city had decided was the only safe answer to a catalyst. Scatter the shards. Kill 3 champions. Cage the 4th and the girl. Make very sure the 4 pieces of the drowned power never came home. They hit the tower with everything, and 3 champions, with their 4th drawn away, held the line for a woman they would not stop calling worth it, against 2 houses who had decided she was too dangerous to live whole. They told me to run. All 3 of them, the same word at the same instant down 3 threads. Run. The keystone preserved, the source saved, the sensible move, the only one with a future in it. And I wanted understood, whatever I became after, that I made my choice with my eyes open, the way the keeper had told me to, knowing. I did not run. I had spent 26 years running, from 11 homes and every good thing in them, because running was the one power a thrown-away thing is allowed. And I stood in the breaking tower with 3 men bleeding to keep me whole, and understood I was finished running, not because I was brave, but because for the first time in my life I'd found the thing you don't run from, and it was 4 broken men and a city that didn't deserve me and might, with enough love poured into it. Learn to. A woman who runs from that has nothing left worth the running. I'm not leaving. I told the 3 of them, down 3 threads, and felt their despair and their fierce, stupid joy arrive in the same pulse. You don't leave family to the arithmetic. Hold. I'm coming to you. I have tried many times to write down what that hour was, and I can't, not properly, so I'll tell you the parts that stayed. Bram, in the stairwell, become the great, terrible iron shape, holding a door against a tide of attackers with his own breaking body, roaring at me to run, keystone, run, and refusing to fall. Rune, the deep water, flooding 3 levels of the tower to drown the assault, spending himself so fast I felt the tide thread thinning toward nothing, the holder holding one last time. Sable, cold and exact even now, folding Shadow into 100 blades, fighting his own mother's house with a wall finally, fully down, being out loud, where she could see the flawed, loving thing she'd swore she'd carved out of him, and making her watch. And me in the center of it, reaching down 4 threads, pouring myself into all 3 of them at once the way I'd poured into Cass's fire, keeping 3 champions standing past the point any of them should have stood, and feeling, with every passing minute, the catalyst thing the keeper had warned me of, the 4 shards straining toward each other through me, wanting to come home, the end of the houses, and the healing of the city, both rising in my chest like a held breath. I was one decision, away from letting go. We were losing anyway, 3 against 2 houses. You can love people very much and still lose. And then Cass came back. He came back through his own father's lines, because the spare knew every secret of House Flame, every passage and password, and he'd used the hour his father spent him for to do the one thing nobody plans for the disposable son to do. He'd gone into the heart of House Flame, and he'd come back not with surrender, but with the thing his father most needed kept secret, and he stood in the broken doorway of the tower, bloodied, grinning, the old grin, the real one finally, and he shouted across, the battle the words that turned it. Vaymor, your lords of flame and shadow forged the assassin that broke the accord, together, and I have the proof in my hand. signed in both their names. They're not protecting you from the catalyst. They're using her as the excuse to seize the city for 2 houses out of 4. Look. And he threw it, a single burning page, House Flame's true ledger, lit gold so the whole city could see it fall, and the 2 other houses, Iron and Tide, who had been wavering, who had half believed the source was the danger, saw their champions bleeding to defend her and their rival lords exposed in the same instant, and the battle, which had been 3 against 2 houses, became something else entirely. I felt it turn through the bond before I saw it with my eyes. House Iron's fighters, who'd come to scatter the shards, faltered because their own champion, Bram, was in that stairwell bleeding for the source, and a house will believe a great many things until it watches its best son choose the supposed monster over the lords giving the orders. House Tide's forces wavered the same way, looking at Rune, framed a day ago as a killer, now drowning himself to shield the very keystone he'd supposedly tried to murder. The proof in Cass's burning hand and the blood on 3 champions' bodies arrived in the same instant, and you cannot argue a city out of what it is watching its heroes do. The lie that the source was the danger had needed the champions to look like victims or villains. Instead, they looked like exactly what they were, 4 thrown-away men who'd found something worth dying whole for, and the city, which had been 1 hour from scattering me, looked at them and changed its mind in the space of a held breath. It became a war for the Accord, with me at the center of it. Exactly the war I'd traded everything to prevent, except now it was being fought over whether to keep me, not scatter me, and I did not have time to feel the horror of that, because in the chaos of the turning, Flame's lord did the last cruel thing a cruel man does when he loses. He went for his son. I felt it before I saw it. Cass's gold thread, bright and brave and finally unafraid, and then his father's blade, and then the thread guttering. The way Cass's fire had guttered the night, I poured myself in to save it. I was across the tower. Bram was holding a door. Rune was spent. Sable was fighting his mother. And Cass who'd just turned to war. Cass the spare who'd finally, gloriously, mattered on his own terms and not his father's, was going down in the broken doorway with his own father's knife in him and that gold thread going out, and there was no one near enough to reach him. No one but me. And the only thing I had that could cross that distance in time was the thing the Keeper had drowned himself to warn me about. So I stopped holding it back. I reached for all 4 threads at once. Not to pour into them this time, but to pull, to call the 4 shards home through me the way the catalyst was always going to, the end of the houses and the healing of the city, the whole drowned power that 4 frightened founders had split 4 ways and exiled and prayed I'd never reassemble, and I felt it begin, vast and bright and unstoppable. 4 quarters of a god reuniting in the body of a foster kid with a paring knife to save 1 dying man. The whole world had agreed didn't matter. The Keeper's question, the one it had drowned 300 years to ask me, arrived in the half-second before I let go. Is this city a thing that deserves to be healed, or only a thing to be contained? The founders couldn't answer it. They split a god and exiled the key, and called their cowardice peace. And I, a bartender, a foster kid, 11 homes and 0 good ones, the last frightened drop of a drowned power, answered it the only way I had ever known how to answer anything, by looking at 1 dying person who'd finally been brave, and deciding he was worth the whole world ending or beginning over. Not the city.
Yeah.
I'd love the city later, if there was a later. Right then there was only a man going out like a gold thread in the dark, who'd spent his whole life being told he didn't matter, and a woman who'd spent her whole life being told the same, and only one of us still had the power to make it a lie.
So I made it a lie.
I chose him. I chose all 4 of them, and the city they were made of, and the healing the founders had been too frightened to risk, and I stopped being careful for the first time and the last with everything I was. The 4-colored light in the tower flared to white. Every wolf in Vaymore felt it. Sable's mother screamed something that might have been a no, or might have been my name, and the world began, very fast, to come apart and back together in a shape it hadn't worn in 300 years. What I became in that doorway, to save Cass, whether the city was a thing that deserved to be healed or only contained, and which one I made it, and whether the unchosen son lived to find out he'd finally, truly been chosen, is where it stops being free. To be continued in episode 9. You've reached the end of the free chapters. Episodes 1 to 8 were the binding, the whole of the Catalyst's war, and which of the 4 crowns she's still standing beside when the light fades, continues for Inner Circle members in episode 9 and beyond. That was episode 8 of 4 Crowns. If the 4 of them have you now, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus bonus scenes are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
I've Mia.
Thank you for listening.